have upset that natural balance such that we can now observe billions of tons of carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere that we can prove is the result of human activity.
So what do you say to that argument put forward by Andy Pittman and others?
I think it's absolute rubbish. I mean, the number of people who argue that there's some kind of natural equilibrium in the atmosphere and the Earth's climate, I mean, it is one of the most absurd ideas, and it's propagated by a lot of people who really ought to know better.
Here's another contentious claim in your film. Again, it's based on the historical record. You claim that the period between the 9th and the 13th centuries was hotter than today. Let's look at that.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
Now, do you still stand by that claim?
Yes.
Here's what our climatologist said about that.
When I saw this picture, which shows the medieval warm period warmer than now, and the right-hand side says now, this picture's 20 years old. All the data since then has come off the top.
There is little doubt that the last 5 or 7 years has been warmer than any time in the medieval warm period, and that's what we're absolutely certain about.
So to show a graph that's 20 years out of date, not to show what happened at the end, not to report the reports, that's just a lie.
So the question is, why didn't you use the latest or even the recent IPCC charts?
Because the IPCC charts that they'd like me to use aren't reliable. The reason why we used that was that it was a very famous graph produced by Herbert Lamb, who's
What
possibly the most...
year was that?
Early 90s, I think.
Why did you use a graph that was 17 years old when you could have used more modern data which shows what's happened in that past 17 years?
Well, firstly, if you look at what's happened in the past 17 years, you don't find a huge change. I mean, we've got to get this thing in perspective. When we're talking about temperature change in the past... No, hold on. When you're talking about the temperature change in the past 150 years, you're talking about a temperature change of just over ½ degree Celsius in a very noisy record where the error bars are very considerable. So when you talk about temperature change in the past 20 years, you're talking, in terms of our knowledge of the climate history of the last 1,000 years, of a very tiny amount of change. I'd love to...
We have a very accurate knowledge of it because the instruments are almost perfect. We know exactly what temperature rises there have been in the past 17 years.
That's very untrue. We don't have a very accurate knowledge of it at all. We had a huge problem at the end of the Soviet Union that they closed a lot of their temperature reading stations.
17 years ago we had an accurate knowledge and now we don't. Well, I have a very simple question about your use of this graph because it says it's a chart of the temperature over 1,000 years right up to now. Now to me means 2007. But in fact, this graph doesn't go anywhere near 2007, does it?
Well, I mean, you can't just get a graph that's produced by Herbert Lamb on the various statistics and then add another bit of line to it.
I just want to get you to answer this question, why you said now when it isn't now.
Well, that's what the IPCC does. It refers to, years before now. I mean, in terms
goes up
of
to what, 90?
In terms of
90.
In terms of the error bars of that graph, it is absurd to quibble on the when it finishes in terms of tens of dates.
Well, it's not absurd because the 1990 graph, IPCC 1990 graph you used, was superseded in the second IPCC report in 1995, in the third in 2001, in the fourth in 2007. Why didn't you use one of those?
I'll tell you exactly why we didn't use one of those. They were superseded by graphs which eliminated the medieval warm period. If you look at the old picture of the last 1,000 years, there's the medieval warm period, it goes down to the Little Ice Age and then up again. I'm trying to do that backwards so that people can understand. What it was replaced with was something which became known as the hockey stick, because it looks like a hockey stick because it goes trundling along the bottom and then comes up in a manner which looks more alarming than if it just sort of dips and then comes up again.
It is alarming because it shows a rapid rise in temperature from 1990 to 2007.
Which is why scientists then looked at the hockey stick to see, because it contradicted every other sort of set of data we had for the last 1,000 years.
By saying now in the graph, you've left yourself open to the charge that you've deliberately misrepresented the graph and that you've left out 17 years of growing temperatures which don't prove your point.
But this is what they do. They'll fix on something which is a moot point. Personally, I still think it's perfectly legitimate to refer to the late 20th century as now, just as the IPCC did.
But they are hotter than the medieval warming period.
No, they're not.
Well, yes, they are,
no,
according to the graphs.
According to the hockey stick they are, but the hockey stick is greatly mistaken.
Let's continue, because your film answers the question, or tries to answer the question, why is it getting hotter, with the theory that it's in fact the sun that causes global warming.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for almost 4 decades, and then started to rise again.
Once again, we asked our climatologists to have a look at this section of the film and to comment on it.
They stopped the record because they don't mention it falls when the temperature continues, so it's classic. Pick the section of the record that fits your preconception and then leave out the inconvenient parts.
The graph conveniently stops at 1980, when the temperature starts to rise much more rapidly and the solar activity decreases, the opposite of what they claim.
Why didn't you just continue that graph on to the present day? Because there are graphs available which do that.
Well, firstly, the graph that we were using was created by Professor Friis Christensen from the Danish Space Agency. So it would have been completely... I can't remember off the top of my head.
25 years ago.
Yeah, and it was in a period where a part of the program where we're talking about, it was a historical part of the program where we're talking about key discoveries in the history of, recent history of climatology.
Shall I tell you what happens
Entirely.
after 1980? The temperature continues to rise very sharply. Solar activity falls off in the other direction. Now, that would have been very hard to explain in your film, wouldn't it, if you'd actually used the modern data?
Well, I mean, the graph that we used from Friis Christensen was the graph that he published in a very famous paper that sort of came out and was in part of the program that we were talking about, the history of people's understanding of what the solar effects might have been on the temperature of the 20th century.
The section, as you say, is based on his work, but when he and his colleagues saw your graphs and the way in which you'd use them in the program, they felt compelled to correct you. They wrote this, that their latest studies had explicitly concluded that after 1985, temperature continued to rise, just as I said, while the sunspot cycle length flattened out and thus no longer correlated with surface temperature. And they went on to say this point was not included in the narrator's statement.
But the point is, we've been inundated so much by the argument that CO2 is driving temperature change in the 20th century. But what very few people are ever told, that there is an extraordinary correlation between solar activity and CO2 for large parts of the 20th century. Now, why aren't we told that? There is not a very strong correlation between CO2 and temperature of the 20th century. There is a strong correlation between solar activity and the 20th century.
Why weren't we told? Why weren't we, the audience, entitled to know that the data for temperature and solar activity diverges sharply after that period?
It's a very moot point. What happens after that period?
Well, not according to the Danish scientists, it isn't.
Oh, well, according to many other climatologists, it's a very moot point what happens after that.
The story of the graphs gets even more interesting in a way, because in the original version of the swindle, you had another of the Danish graphs, which they say contained false data. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, we had they've got a graph that has 400 years of temperature change and 400 years of solar activity, and there was a gap of a very small gap at one section in I think it's either solar activity or temperature, one or the other, and our graphics guy very helpfully joined it up, which was very embarrassing, and we've now corrected it for subsequent versions.
How many versions of the swindle have you actually put out since the complaints started to come through?
Oh, I mean, you'd have to ask Channel 4 that. I don't know. I mean, we've got an international version.
I've counted at least 4, which have slight or major differences in them.
Oh, no, we immediately made the changes that we could straight away before we could get other graphs done. And then for subsequent ones, we've had graphs redone and to correct the errors that were pointed out. But I mean, the thing is, the basic argument isn't changed by
why
these.
were there so many errors in the beginning? This is the strange thing.
Oh, because, you know, it took us 6 weeks to get this thing edited. I had 3 edit suites going at the same time, and the graphics arrived, you know, a day before the program went out. And so, you know what the nature of television is. We put the program out. We hope that it's right.